Welcome. We have a special guest with us today for Latin Business Today and the Sports Business Institute. A young man by the name of Anthony Pardo. Anthony, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Why don't you tell us a little bit? I know you're with Major League Baseball. We'll get into that in a second. But why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your background, education, things like that?
Yeah. So grew up in Brooklyn, New York, which is coincidentally where I still reside today. And can't get enough of it. I went to St. John's University, so spent a few years in Queens, and then came back to Brooklyn. And while at St. John's, I majored in journalism with a minor in sports management.
Okay.
And then, soon after that, or pretty much upon graduation, I ended up at MLB pretty quickly after that. Um, so yeah.
The journalism major is very interesting to me, and I looked at your background on LinkedIn, and you have some writing experience.
Yeah.
I run a master's degree program in sport business management at Manhattan College, and one of the things we tell our students
Nice.
is, writing is still very important. And I have a young son
Mhm.
who's 22 years old and the daughter, and it's like I try to explain to them, yeah, I understand you need to get everything into your character fit, for your tweet stuff, but you still need to be able to write, succinct and clearly. Have you found that the writing has helped you in your career?
Yeah. You know, I would even go as far as saying, in a lot of ways, it prepared me for this position at MLB, just coincidentally in how, my career turned out. While I was in college, obviously majoring in journalism, I don't want to date myself too much, but that was around what 2005, four, around there. I ended up writing for New York Newsday, which is a paper I think you're familiar with.
Got it. So let's drop back a little bit. Tell me a little bit about your background as a sports person growing up.
Yeah, so I think growing up, I like most kids, love sports, especially when you live in New York. It's
Mhm.
we like to think in many ways it's a sports capital across all the pro sports teams, and they take it back a step. Grew up loving baseball and basketball and football and all the sports and hockey,
Mhm.
and my family came to New York in, gosh, I want to say it was like 67, 1967. They immigrated from Ecuador.
Okay.
So they came here with my brother, who was two or three at the time, and you know you're coming to New York in 1967 from a foreign country, and in Ecuador and South America, soccer is really big, so definitely that was still an important part of, like, for my father and some of his other family that came here. They love soccer, but then you're starting to adapt to American sports. You come to New York in 1967, 68, you get to 69, and what happens? The Mets win the World Series, the Jets win the Super Bowl, the Knicks win the NBA title, and coincidentally, what happened to me, I end up, you know, getting handed down that fandom because those are the first teams that were winning in New York, and there was a lot of buzz. So I grew up as a kid rooting for all three of these teams, right? And have gone up and down and stayed loyal through the successful years and the non-successful years,
Yep.
and still really love sports in that regard. And that was a big part of me growing up, playing baseball since I was 8 years old, which was definitely my favorite sport. On par with basketball. Basketball is not very good. Baseball, I was much better. So stuck with it, played varsity baseball, played, even while I was in college, played in some, rec leagues and whatnot. And then, also did cross country and track in high school, like typical, athlete, doing a couple of different athletes, uh, um, a couple of different sports while I was in school. So sports has been a huge part of my life, and definitely, like, growing up in New York, being a fan, like, as a kid, you're a teenager. It's like the Mets going to World Series, and Mike Piazza, and one of my favorites of all time, Edgardo Alfonso, right? One of the greatest Latin players in New York sports history. And then the Knicks were so great in the '90s growing up. Patrick Ewing, John Starks, Allen Houston, Larry Johnson. Like, those are really my two favorite teams,
Yeah.
and still are today. Really, really enjoyed that, and that
Yeah.
was a big part of my growing up, but also impacting why I probably wanted to be a sports writer going into college, because I just loved sports so much and was around it, that I was like, this might be the career I want to go to.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's it's funny because obviously I laughed a little bit when you said you were dating yourself. I mean, I went to college in the 80s and 90s, so but I actually I did live. I was alive when the Mets won in '69. I wasn't that old, but I was alive, and the Jets, and these are all my teams too, and the Knicks, and of course for me the Islanders because I grew up on Long Island. But um,
Sure.
I feel bad. My son is 22 and he roots for all the teams that I root for. And I just feel, I'm like, when he was younger, I'm like, you don't have to root for my teams. And I'm trying to talk him out of it because I just don't. It's such a torturous thing
Right.
sometimes. But that's being a fan. So so
Right.
you go to St. John's, do some sports writing or and get some skill sets, and then tell me about the MLB position. What prepared you for it? How it came about and all that.
So, but, as I alluded to before, right, majoring in journalism, kind of figured after that experience, again, have these bylines, great experience, understand what it's like, kind of wanted to pivot. And, I went on to graduate. And one piece of advice I'd always give to people is like, especially today, no one should feel that if you majored in one thing, you can't pivot to do something else. I think that sometimes is a very big misconception amongst young people. I'm majoring in business, so I have to go into business. Sometimes your major is not necessarily what you end up doing in your career. There's so many people that happens to, right? So I think for me, it was like, okay, I want to stay in sports, and that was my minor, sports management, which at the time was still a very like a budding um, uh, discipline in colleges. It still hadn't flushed out the way it is today, where there's full, degrees and bachelor's in sports management and master's programs, so on and so forth. So post college, I ended up working for a nonprofit for a little bit called Management Leadership for Tomorrow, which is a great nonprofit, really that works to help Latinos and Black professionals, young professionals who are already working. They want to go to top business schools. This is a great program to help coach you to get into top 25 business schools. And then they also had a internship program for students of color already in school, junior, senior year in undergrad, who want to get these internships. And one of their partners at the time happened to be MLB. And while I was working there, I made, a contact, which is a big thing, right, is networking. So I networked and made a contact who was an alumni of their program. And he happened to also be at the time the director of recruitment at MLB. And, I want to get into sports. And I'm like, oh my God, this is baseball. This might be an awesome opportunity. And, networked with him. And he said, here are the opportunities we have available right now. And, at that time, the only one the only open position was a role in our office operations team. And I took it. I applied and interviewed and got the role. And I think that was, as fate would have it, that was probably the best opportunity I could have ever asked for in order for me to really understand the organization. Again, noting what I said before about pivoting from journalism, want to get into sports, but really don't know what I want to do. In this role, I interacted with practically everyone in the league office and learned about what they did, what the composition of the varying business functions were. And this role ultimately, really afforded me the opportunity to make tons of relationships, network with tons of people. Again, the role was centered on delivering mail and doing reception work. So again, you're really touching every group of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really a phenomenal opportunity for me to really understand things that, as a fan, you don't think about what special events does or what licensing does. Like you go to Modell's or Dick's Sporting Goods and you see all this apparel, but you don't think about how it got onto that rack and all the various things that had to happen before to get it there, right? So again, great opportunity. And then after a year in that, I, got an opportunity to apply for a role on our marketing and advertising team. And I was very fortunate to get that position and spent 3 years working on our cause-related marketing campaign. So our community relationships, right, like Boys and Girls Club, Jackie Robinson Day, right, Mother's Day and Father's Day, our partnerships with, Susan Coleman and things like that at the time, and people probably have seen the pink wristbands, blue wristbands. So that was a really interesting thing to work on because it's such an important part of who MLB is. And then the other part of the role was working on our brand advertising, which I always laugh because at the time, you know, a few years after college, again, noting back to what I said before, not knowing where we were going to go in journalism, right, with print media moving more online, you know, traditional marketing, buying advertising in newspapers and magazines and promoting, you know, our World Series, the All-Star Game, opening day, our big events through newspapers and TV buys and things like that, well before we really started getting to a digital space. So I did that for about 3 years. And then after that, I moved into a role in our corporate partnerships team where I've spent, this is, I think, my 10th year on the corporate partnerships team. And the role has very much evolved for me. And yeah, ever since, you know, that's kind of been my story at baseball. So coming up on 15 years in the organization and 3 different departments and 3, in many ways, different roles, albeit this role where I'm in currently has evolved over the, you know, 10 years or so I've been on this team in particular.